Here is the storage section. So balls in the storage can be stored in one of two ways. They can either be inside of this railing, or they can be inside of these pegs. Now you might be wondering why this storage section even has these pegs in the first place, because it doesn't seem necessary, right? And you'll be right, it really isn't necessary, but you've probably already noticed that all of the other sections of this clock, the timekeeping, the display, and the collector, they're all unconventional in some way, and I didn't want the storage to be an exception to that. So this peg section is really here just to demonstrate that there are other ways to store the steel balls besides this railing method here. Here's the storage section after it's been filled up by the two tanks. Now if we go ahead and look on top, you can see that there's a horizontal funnel over here that makes it a little easier to pour the contents of the tank into the storage. So the storage seems pretty simple, right? Well, it turns out that in addition to storing the balls, it needs to make it so that the timekeeper can actually use those balls. And that was actually quite a challenge. It took me quite a few tries before I was able to figure it out. You see, the secondary escapement needs the steel balls to be in one coherent line like this. That way it can actually run properly. If I just fed it this random jumble of steel balls over here instead, it would not be able to work properly. So I need this taper here to convert this random jumble of steel balls into one coherent line that can actually be used. However, in my early experiments on taper designs, such as this one, I realized that if I filled it up with balls, it would tend to jam up, which is obviously an issue because I can't have the storage jamming up during operation. So I did some more experiments, and I realized that there were some designs that work pretty well. Designs like this one, and this one, and there were more, but we won't worry about those. I also realized there were designs that worked really poorly. Designs like this one, and this one. Now this one was a little unusual because it looks really similar to the one I just showed you, the good one. But the only difference is that this opening here is larger. And it turns out that makes a pretty big difference because this design right here actually functioned the worst out of all of the ones I tested. In fact, let me go and demonstrate. So here it is filled up with balls, and I'll go ahead and release it now. Okay, and I can just give it a shake. And the thing to notice is that even if balls come out this way, then the balls will just go right back to jamming, so it's not gonna work. Anyways, after all of this experimentation, I realized that practically all of the jamming I was seeing was occurring where the taper was around 2 to 3 balls wide. Moreover, I learned two things about good taper design. Number one, I need to reduce the number of ways the balls can enter into that 2 to 3 ball wide section of taper. This design performed really poorly because the balls can enter in from so many different directions, and therefore they can enter in from conflicting directions and therefore contribute to a jam. The second thing I learned about good taper design is that, I need to reduce the amount of pressure going down the taper. To understand why, simply imagine a crowd trying to exit a building. The harder they push against the door, the harder it is for anyone to leave the building. These are actually the reasons why I switched from a vertical taper design like this one to a horizontal taper design. For instance, I'm able to make this taper much longer without adding much height to the clock. So that means that by the time the balls get to that 2 to 3 ball wide section of taper, they're pretty much all headed in the same direction, so there's not much conflicting going on over there. Moreover, the pressure going down the taper is reduced by quite a bit, because if you think about the vertical taper, gravity is trying to pull the ball straight down this taper, but over here, gravity is not going to have much of a component this way, so the pressure is greatly reduced. In fact, when I test this design out, it vastly outperforms the vertical taper by quite a bit, so that's why the current clock design pretty much has this same taper design. You're probably tired of me saying the word taper, so let's move on. Let's talk about this weird looking bend in the track over here. So, with all these balls over here, it's exerting a pretty significant pressure downwards. And also, whenever the secondary escapement releases a ball, these balls suddenly move forward and create a spike in pressure. And this high pressure situation is not very good for the secondary escapement because it can cause it to malfunction. For this reason, this bend in the track is just meant to help the frame absorb some of that shock and pressure and therefore allow the secondary escapement to enjoy a slightly lower pressure state and therefore function properly. This little opening that you see above that ball doesn't really serve much of a purpose in this current clock design, but in previous clock designs, it was important because whenever the secondary escapement released the ball, this ball would rise up slightly, so I needed the space over there. In this current clock design though, it serves as a little access port so I can insert or remove the ball if I felt like it. Let's talk about the secondary escapement now. It might seem like if I were to put enough pressure on this ball here, it would be enough to force this ball out. Well, it turns out that unless I seriously bend or break something, I cannot force this ball out by pushing on the one above it. Let me show you why using the CAD model. So here's the timekeeping section. Let's go ahead and chop it in half like we did with the collector and go into orthographic view. Okay, and I'll focus in on this section here and we will add some balls. Okay, so this is what the setup looks like, the setup I just showed you. So I'm just going to go ahead and hide the purple ball for now just to make things a little clearer. When this blue ball moves down, if you think about it, it has to force the secondary escapement to move counterclockwise. Well, it turns out that because of that, when it moves down with the purple ball in place over there, and it forces the secondary escapement to move counterclockwise, that effectively forces the purple ball to move up against the blue ball. And obviously the steel balls can't just intersect like this, so it's physically impossible for the blue ball to move down unless something seriously deforms or breaks.